In the 1820s, the vast and verdant expanse of the upper Mississippi River was more than just a landscape. It was a homeland. For millennia, it had been the ancestral territory of the Ho-Chunk people, a nation whose history was etched into the rivers, bluffs, and forests. But this ancient world was now on a collision course with a new, aggressive power, the United States. Beneath the soil of the Ho-Chunk homeland lay a resource that would fuel America's westward expansion: lead. The conflict that erupted here in 1827 is known to history as the Winnebago War. Yet it was hardly a war in the conventional sense. It was a brief, desperate, and bloody reaction to a relentless invasion of land and culture. This is the story of that uprising, a microcosm of the 19th century tragedy of American Indian policy. At its heart is the story of a respected Ho-Chunk leader, Redbird, a man of peace who was pushed to violence and whose personal sacrifice would ultimately pave the way for the seizure of his people's land. Before the land could be taken, it had to be defined. In August 1825, the United States government convened a Grand Council at Prairie, Chien. Thousands of representatives from the Sioux, Sac and Fox, Menominee, Ho-Chunk, and other regional tribes gathered. The stated purpose was noble: to end decades of intertribal warfare by establishing firm, recognized boundaries between the nations. The treaty signed here ceded no land to the United States. American negotiators, including territorial governors William Clark and Lewis Cass, declared that their country had no designs on the land northwest of the Mississippi. But this act of peacemaking was in reality a masterful stroke of bureaucratic warfare. By imposing the foreign, Western concept of fixed property lines onto a world of shared and fluid territories, the treaty effectively cleared the title to the land. It created a legal framework that made future land acquisition vastly more efficient. Instead of negotiating with complex confederations, the U.S. could now target individual tribes, pressuring them to sell specific, legally defined tracts. The 1825 Treaty of Prairie du Chien was not about peace between tribes. It was the first, indispensable step in a systematic campaign of dispossession. While diplomats drew lines on maps, a different kind of fever was gripping the frontier. The discovery of vast, easily accessible lead deposits in the region triggered a lead rush. Beginning in the early 1820s, a flood of American miners poured into the territory legally recognized as belonging to the Ho-Chunk. By 1825, over 10,000 of these illegal squatters were on Ho-Chunk land. This was not a peaceful settlement, it was an invasion. The miners were aggressive, trespassing with impunity, stealing resources, and frequently abusing the native inhabitants. The Ho-Chunk, who had mined and traded lead for generations as a cornerstone of their economy, were now being violently displaced from their own industry on their own land. The U.S. government, far from protecting the tribe's treaty-recognized rights, actively worked to undermine them. Officials sought to dissuade the Indians from their mining plans, fearing that a successful Ho-Chunk mining operation would delay what they saw as the inevitable American possession of the mining region. On this foundation of theft and abuse, a series of specific events built tensions to a breaking point. In 1826, the murder of the Methode family, French-Canadian settlers near Prairie du Chien, led to the arrest of 6 Ho-Chunk men. Though 4 were eventually released, 2 remained imprisoned in the guardhouse at Fort Crawford, creating a lingering sense of unresolved injustice. Later that year, in a move that would prove disastrous, the U.S. Army evacuated Fort Crawford, relocating the garrison to Fort Snelling and taking the 2 Ho-Chunk prisoners with them. To the settlers, it signaled a federal government unable to protect them. To some Ho-Chunk, it was a sign of American weakness, a window of opportunity for retaliation. Then came the spark. A false rumor spread like wildfire through the Ho-Chunk villages. The 2 prisoners had not simply been moved. They had been turned over to their hated enemies, the Chippewa, and brutally tortured and executed. This explosive piece of disinformation transformed a general sense of being wronged into a specific, intolerable outrage. It was a direct call to action under the Ho-Chunk Code of Justice, a life for a life. Compounding this were other fresh wounds, including reports that the crew of an American keelboat had recently abducted and raped several Ho-Chunk women. The pressure of the miners, the injustice of the arrests, the perceived opportunity of the fort's evacuation, and the catalytic rumor of the executions created a perfect storm. For some Ho-Chunk, a violent response was no longer a choice, it was a sacred duty. The man called upon to deliver this justice was Wanning Schutz, known to the Americans as Redbird. He was a prominent leader of his people, a man of impressive physical stature and quiet dignity. For years, Redbird had been known as one of the most friendly and trusted Ho-Chunk leaders, a proponent of peace with the encroaching Americans. But now, faced with the supposed murder of his kinsman and the relentless pressure from the miners, he was cornered. Tribal leaders, compelled by custom and the anger of their people, implored Redbird to retaliate. He was not a warmonger seeking conflict, but a leader bound by duty to uphold his nation's honor and answer a grievous wrong. His path was a tragic one, forced from a position of peace to one of violence. On June 28, 1827, Redbird, along with two other warriors, Wekau and Chicken-Sick, traveled to Prairie du Chien to seek revenge. They arrived at the isolated cabin of Registry Gagny. Gagny, who knew Redbird personally, welcomed the three men into his home and offered them refreshment. What happened next plunged the frontier into terror. Inside the small cabin, the friendly welcome turned violent. Redbird raised his gun and shot Gagny dead. At the same time, Solomon Lipcap, a hired man, was also killed. Amid the chaos and smoke, Gagny's wife, Thérèse, grabbed her young son and managed to escape. Left behind in the confusion was her infant daughter, Marie. One of the warriors stabbed and scalped the child, leaving her for dead on the floor. The attackers took the scalps and fled, their act of retribution complete according to their laws. But the brutality of the attack, especially on an infant, sent a wave of panic through the settler communities. Miraculously, the baby, Marie Gagny, survived her horrific injuries. The violence was not over. 2 days later, on June 30th, a larger war party of about 150 Ho-Chunk, joined by a few Dakota allies, gathered near the mouth of the Bad Axe River. They spotted two American keelboats making their way down the Mississippi after delivering supplies to Fort Snelling. One of the boats was named the Oliver H. Perry. The name was a potent symbol of American military power. Oliver Hazard Perry was the great naval hero of the War of 1812, whose victory on Lake Erie had helped crush the British and their native allies in the region. An attack on a vessel bearing his name was an attack on the very idea of American dominance. For the Ho-Chunk, the motivation was more immediate. They believed this was the same boat whose crew had recently assaulted their women. As the boats drifted near the shore, the warriors opened fire. In the ensuing skirmish, 2 American crewmen were killed and 4 were wounded. The Ho-Chunk suffered about 7 casualties. Though a small engagement, this ambush was profoundly significant. It was the first act of open war committed by Native Americans against the United States in the region since the War of 1812. A localized act of revenge had now escalated into a direct military confrontation. The American response was swift, massive, and utterly disproportionate. The specter of a general Indian war terrified the frontier. Michigan Territorial Governor Lewis Cass, who was in Galena when news of the attacks arrived, immediately began organizing local militias. Regular U.S. Army troops were mobilized. Colonel Josiah Snelling descended from the north, bringing 200 soldiers from Fort Snelling to reoccupy the abandoned Fort Crawford. From the south, Brigadier General Henry Atkinson led a large column of federal troops up the Mississippi from Jefferson Barracks in Missouri. In Illinois, Governor Ninian Edwards called up 600 mounted militia volunteers. In total, a federal and state military force of over 600 soldiers converged on the Ho-Chunk heartland near Portage. Another force of militias, reinforced by over 100 Menominee, Oneida, and Stockbridge warriors, assembled at Green Bay to the east. This overwhelming show of force was designed not just to find Redbird, but to intimidate any other tribe that might consider joining the uprising. The strategy worked. While many tribes were sympathetic to the Ho-Chunk's grievances, their leaders urged neutrality. The Potawatomi, the Dakota, and even other Ho-Chunk bands refused to join Redbird's fight. Isolated and facing a military pincer movement, the small band of warriors from Prairie Lacrosse stood alone.
Redbird saw the inevitable. To continue the fight would mean the annihilation of his people. To save his nation from a war it could not win, he made the decision to sacrifice himself. On September 2, 1827, he surrendered to the American forces at the Portage. The moment was one of the most dramatic in Wisconsin history, captured in the vivid accounts of American officials who were present. Redbird approached the American camp not as a defeated criminal, but as a warrior performing his final duty. He was, as U.S. official Thomas McKinney wrote, clad in pure white elkskin, holding a white flag and chanting his death song. McKinney was awestruck by the chief's bearing, his grace and dignity of firmness and decision, all tempered with mildness and mercy. He wrote, "I could not but ask myself, can this man be a murderer?" Redbird expected to be put to death on the spot. It was the honorable end he had chosen, a life given freely to spare the lives of his women and children. But the Americans operated under a different code. They did not execute Redbird. Instead, they took him prisoner, to be held for a trial under U.S. law. This act was utterly incomprehensible to the Ho-Chunk. Their leaders were baffled and distressed. As they explained to an American agent, they had surrendered the men who committed the killings not to be tried, but to be killed. They had confessed their deeds. The surrender was meant to be the final act of justice, the balancing of the scales that would prevent a wider war and save their country. The American legal process, with its delays, its strange rituals of trial, and its punishment of imprisonment, seemed to them a dishonorable and meaningless cruelty. This profound cultural chasm revealed the irreconcilable worldviews at the heart of the conflict. Denied the warrior's death he expected, Redbird languished in the military prison at Fort Crawford. The proud leader who had surrendered in magnificent attire to save his people was now confined to a cell, a captive of a legal system he did not understand. On February 16, 1828, while still awaiting his trial, Redbird died of dysentery. It was the ultimate indignity, not a swift end on a battlefield, but a slow wasting death from disease. His two companions, Wacow and Chiconsik, were later convicted of murder, but in a final twist of American justice, they were pardoned by President John Quincy Adams and released. Redbird's sacrifice had averted a slaughter, but it came at a terrible price. The U.S. government now had the perfect pretext to achieve its ultimate goal, the legal acquisition of the lead-rich lands. The Winnebago War, a conflict that consisted of only a few attacks and skirmishes, was leveraged to justify a massive land seizure. In a treaty signed at Prairie du Chien in August 1829, the Ho-Chunk were compelled to cede the entire lead mining region, the very land the miners had illegally invaded, to the United States. The exchange was starkly unequal. The payments were temporary, set to expire after 30 years. A significant portion of the funds was immediately diverted to pay off debts to American traders. The land, however, was ceded forever. To enforce this new reality, the U.S. military tightened its grip on the territory. Fort Crawford was permanently re-garrisoned, and in 1828, construction began on a new, powerful fortification, Fort Winnebago, strategically placed at the vital portage between the Fox and Wisconsin rivers. Together with Fort Howard at Green Bay and Fort Crawford at Prairie du Chien, this new post formed an iron triangle of military control over the entire region. Its purpose was explicit: to protect American commerce, to intimidate the native population, and to ensure that future land cessions and removals would be carried out without resistance. Among the first garrison at the new fort was a young, ambitious lieutenant named Jefferson Davis.